The preacher found a baby in the church bell tower with a note that made him question everything. The sun bleeds its last light over Mercy Creek as the wooden steps creak under heavy boots. A baby's cry cuts through the evening silence like a prayer no one wanted to hear. The bell tower holds secrets wrapped in torn cloth and a bloodstained note that will change everything a man thought he knew about forgiveness. Samuel climbed the narrow wooden stairs of the bell tower, just as he had every evening for the past 3 months. His boots made the same tired sounds against the worn planks, and his breathing came heavy in the thin air. The rope that once pulled the great bronze bell hung motionless beside him, thick with dust and the weight of silence. The bell had not rung since the hanging, not since Judge Morrison ordered the rope around that young Mexican's neck for stealing horses. The whole town had gathered that morning, their faces hard as winter stone, watching justice swing in the desert wind. Samuel had stood with them, had spoken a final prayer over a man whose name he never learned. But something died in him that day, something that made pulling the bell rope feel like a sin. Now he climbed these stairs each evening to sit with the silence, to think about words he should have said and choices he should have made. The bell tower had become his place for talking to God about the things that kept him awake at night. But tonight, the silence was broken. A baby's cry filled the small space above the church, thin and desperate as a dying wind. Samuel's heart stopped for a moment before his legs carried him faster up the remaining steps. There, in the corner where the bell rope coiled like a sleeping snake, lay a bundle of torn cloth. The crying came from inside it. Samuel's hands shook as he knelt beside the bundle. The cloth was stained with something dark that might have been blood or dirt or both. His fingers pulled back the fabric with the care of a man handling broken glass. Inside, a baby no bigger than a loaf of bread screamed with lungs that seemed too strong for such a tiny body. The child's face was red from crying, small fists waving in the air like he was fighting something Samuel couldn't see. Dark hair stuck to the baby's scalp with sweat, and when the little eyes opened between sobs, they were the deepest blue Samuel had ever seen. Blue like the summer sky, just before a storm. Beside the bundle lay a piece of paper, folded small and stained with the same dark marks as the cloth. Samuel picked it up with careful fingers and opened it by the fading light that came through the bell tower's single window. The handwriting was familiar, though it shook with emotion or fear. The words were simple, written in pencil that had been pressed hard into the paper. Please care for him. His father was a good man who never got the chance to hold his son. I cannot keep him safe. I cannot give him what he needs. But you can. You know about mercy, even when others have forgotten. His name should be Hope, because that's all I have left to give. God forgive us all. Samuel read the note 3 times before the words truly settled in his mind. His eyes moved from the paper to the baby, who had stopped crying and now looked up at him with those impossible blue eyes. The child's breathing came fast and shallow, like a small bird caught in a cage. The preacher's hands moved without thought, lifting the baby from the bundle of cloth. The child was lighter than he expected, but solid and real in a way that made Samuel's chest tighten. The baby made small sounds, not crying now, but something softer, like he was trying to speak words he didn't yet know. Samuel held the child against his chest and felt the tiny heartbeat through the thin cotton of his shirt. In all his 42 years, he had never held a baby this small, had never felt the complete trust of something so helpless. The weight of it settled on him like a heavy coat. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mesa, leaving the bell tower in gray shadows. Samuel looked down at the baby in his arms, and then at the note still clutched in his other hand. The handwriting nagged at him like a half-remembered song. He had seen those letters before, had watched someone form them with careful strokes. The baby made another small sound and turned his head towards Samuel's chest, seeking warmth or comfort, or perhaps just the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Samuel found himself swaying slightly, the way he had seen mothers do, though he had no memory of learning such a thing. Outside, the sounds of Mercy Creek settling into evening drifted up to the bell tower. Horses being led to stable, dogs barking at shadows. The saloon piano playing a song that sounded sad, even from a distance. All the normal sounds of a town that didn't know its world had just changed. Samuel looked at the great bronze bell hanging silent above them. The rope that would ring it hung, just within reach, covered in dust and neglect. He thought about the last time it had sounded, calling the town to witness what they called justice. The memory sat bitter in his mouth. The baby shifted in his arms, making small sleeping sounds now. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the deep trust that only the very young can give. Samuel felt something move inside his chest, something that had been frozen since the hanging. He thought about the note's words. His father was a good man who never got the chance to hold his son. The Mexican who had died at the end of Judge Morrison's rope had been young, maybe 25. Had he known about this child? Had he died thinking about a son he would never see? Samuel's jaw tightened as he remembered that morning. The young man had said something in Spanish just before the rope tightened. Samuel had always wondered what those last words meant. Now he thought he might know. The baby stirred again, one small hand gripping Samuel's finger with surprising strength. Those blue eyes opened for a moment, looking up at him with complete faith. Samuel felt the weight of that trust settle deeper into his bones. He looked again at the handwriting on the note, the careful way the letters curved, the particular slant of the words. It came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert. He knew who had written these words, knew whose hand had shaken as she pressed the pencil to paper. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. If he was right about the handwriting, then he understood why the baby had been left here, understood why someone thought a preacher might show more mercy than a father or a town, understood why the child's eyes were that particular shade of blue. Samuel closed his eyes and felt the baby's breathing against his chest. When he opened them again, full darkness had settled over Mercy Creek. Stars were beginning to show through the bell tower's window, small points of light in an endless sky. He stood carefully, cradling the child, and looked once more at the silent bell above them. Then he turned toward the narrow stairs, carrying his burden down into the church below. Each step brought him closer to a decision he wasn't ready to make, but one that was already choosing itself in the quiet space of his heart. The baby made no sound as they descended, trusting completely in arms that had never held such precious cargo. The church kitchen becomes a nursery where a preacher learns to warm milk with shaking hands. Old Martha arrives before dawn with cloth diapers and knowing eyes that hold secrets deeper than the desert wells. The baby sleeps between sermons while Samuel wrestles with a truth that could tear Mercy Creek apart. Those blue eyes remind him of someone he once baptized, someone whose father sits in the front pew every Sunday morning. Samuel had never known how loud silence could be until he spent his first night trying to keep a baby quiet. The child seemed to sense that crying would bring unwanted attention, but still he fussed and shifted through the dark hours. Samuel walked the length of the church sanctuary, bouncing the bundle gently, whispering prayers that felt more like pleas. By the time the first gray light crept through the stained glass windows, both man and child were exhausted. Samuel had managed to get the baby to drink a little water from a teaspoon, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. The child needed milk, needed proper care, needed things Samuel had no idea how to provide. The sound of the church door opening made Samuel's heart jump. He turned, still holding the baby, to see old Martha stepping inside. She moved slowly, her bent back and careful steps speaking of her 70-odd years, but her eyes were sharp as always. She carried a cloth bundle in her arms and studied Samuel with the look of someone who had seen everything the world could offer and wasn't surprised by much anymore. "Figured you might need some help," she said, her voice dry as tumble-wet. Martha had been helping with church matters since before Samuel arrived in Mercy Creek 5 years ago. She cleaned, cooked for church gatherings, and seemed to know everyone's business without ever appearing to listen to gossip. Samuel felt relief wash over him like cool water. "Martha, I don't know what I'm doing. I found him last night, and he needs milk," Martha interrupted, setting down her bundle and moving toward them. "Warm milk every few hours. Clean cloths for diapering." a safe place to sleep. She looked at the baby with eyes that held no judgment, only the practical concern of someone who had raised children before. She opened her bundle and began pulling out strips of soft cotton cloth, a small clay jug, and other supplies Samuel couldn't identify. "My cow's still giving milk, though not as much as she used to. I'll bring some every morning until we figure out something more permanent." The baby stirred at the sound of her voice, those blue eyes opening to study this new face. Martha extended one weathered finger, and the child grasped it with the instinct of all babies. Something passed between them in that moment, some understanding that made Martha nod slowly. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, so quiet Samuel almost missed it. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a question she wasn't ready to ask. "Where did you say you found him?" "In the bell tower." There was a note. Samuel shifted the baby to one arm and pulled the folded paper from his pocket. Martha took it with careful fingers and read it slowly, her lips moving slightly with the words. When she finished, she folded the note and handed it back. Her face showed nothing, but Samuel noticed how her hands shook just slightly as she began arranging the cloth she had brought. "The note was signed?" she asked without looking at him. "No, just those words you read." Martha nodded and lifted the small clay jug. "I'll warm this milk. You'll need to feed him slow, just drops at first. Babies can't handle too much at once." She moved toward the small kitchen area behind the altar, where Samuel prepared communion bread and kept supplies for church gatherings. Samuel followed, still holding the baby. "Martha, the handwriting. It looks familiar to me. I think I might know who." "Sometimes it's better not to know everything," Martha said, her voice firm but not unkind. She was building up the fire in the small stove, adding kindling with practiced movements. "Sometimes a baby just needs caring for, and the rest can wait." But Samuel could see in her careful movements and the way she avoided his eyes that she knew something. Martha had lived in Mercy Creek her entire life. She had watched children grow up, seen them marry, and have children of their own. If anyone would recognize the signs, it would be her. The milk warmed slowly in a small pan. Martha showed Samuel how to test the temperature on the inside of his wrist, how to feed the baby tiny drops from a clean cloth. The child took to it eagerly, small hands grasping at the fabric while he drank. "He's strong," Martha observed, watching the baby feed. "Good appetite. Someone took care of him before he came here, at least for a while." Samuel thought about the note's words again. "I cannot keep him safe." What threatened this child? What had forced someone to give up a baby they had clearly loved enough to care for? As if reading his thoughts, Martha spoke quietly while she cleaned the feeding cloth. "Judge Morrison's been asking questions around town, wondering about young women who might be indisposed recently. Says it's his duty to make sure no illegitimate children become burdens on decent folks." The baby finished drinking and settled back into Samuel's arms with a small sigh of contentment. Samuel felt that familiar tightening in his chest whenever Judge Morrison's name came up. The man attended church every Sunday, sat in the front pew with his wife, contributed generously to the collection. But there was something cold in him, something that made Samuel uncomfortable during every handshake and greeting. "What kind of questions?" Samuel asked. Martha was quiet for a long moment, hanging the clean cloth to dry. When she spoke, her voice was even softer than before. "The kind that make young women leave town. The kind that make families send daughters to visit relatives far away." Samuel understood. In small towns like Mercy Creek, certain shame could not be lived with. Certain mistakes required disappearance rather than forgiveness. He thought again about the blue eyes looking up at him, about handwriting he was almost certain he recognized. "Martha," he said carefully, "if you knew something about this child's family, what would you do?" She turned to face him then, her old eyes holding depths Samuel had never noticed before. "I'd remember that some secrets are kept to protect people, not to hurt them. And I'd ask myself whether speaking the truth would help that baby sleep safer at night." The baby had fallen asleep in Samuel's arms, one small fist curled against his chest. In sleep, the child's face was peaceful, innocent of all the complicated adult questions surrounding his existence. Samuel found himself memorizing that expression, that complete trust. "He'll need a name," Martha said, gathering up her remaining supplies. "Can't just call him baby if people start asking questions." The note suggested Hope. Martha nodded slowly. "Hope, that's a good name for a child who came in the darkness." She moved toward the church door, then paused. "I'll be back tomorrow morning with more milk." "And Samuel? If anyone asks, you found him on the church steps." No need to mention the bell tower or any notes. After she left, Samuel sat in the front pew holding the sleeping child. The morning sun was streaming through the colored glass windows, painting the church in blues and golds. He looked down at the baby, at Hope, and felt something shift inside him. He had spent 3 months avoiding the bell rope, avoiding the questions that haunted him about justice and mercy. But now, holding this child, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the hanging. He felt purpose. The baby stirred, those remarkable blue eyes opening to look up at him. Samuel found himself smiling for the first time in months. Whatever secrets surrounded this child, whatever complicated truths were buried in Mercy Creek's dust, he would protect Hope. He would find a way to give him what the note had asked for: safety and care in a world that often offered neither. But as Samuel sat there in the colored light, he couldn't shake the feeling that protection might require him to face the very truth he was trying to avoid. The judge's heavy boots echo against the church floor as he searches for answers Samuel cannot give. Through whispered confessions and Martha's trembling voice, the story unfolds like a wound being cleaned. Forbidden love between a blue-eyed girl and a young Mexican who died for stealing horses he never touched. The bell tower becomes a sanctuary where broken hearts meet truth, and Samuel must choose between protecting his flock's comfort and defending an innocent child's right to exist. Judge Morrison's shadow filled the church doorway like a storm cloud blocking the sun. Samuel looked up from where he sat feeding Hope, the baby cradled carefully in his arms while tiny fingers grasped at the feeding cloth Martha had left. The judge's boots made heavy sounds against the wooden floor as he walked down the center aisle, his face set in the hard lines Samuel had come to know too well. "Preacher," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority he wore like a badge, "I hear you've taken in a foundling." Samuel continued feeding the baby, keeping his movements calm and steady even as his heart began to race. "A child in need of care, yes. Someone left him on the church steps." Morrison stopped at the front pew, his pale blue eyes studying both man and baby with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. Samuel noticed how those eyes lingered on Hope's face, taking in every detail. The baby looked up at the judge with innocent curiosity, those remarkable blue eyes bright and alert. "Whose child?" Morrison asked, the question sharp as a blade. "I don't know," Samuel answered, which was both true and not true. He suspected, had spent the past 3 days trying not to think about what he suspected, but suspicion wasn't knowledge. Morrison's jaw tightened. He was a man who liked definite answers, clear judgments, simple solutions to complicated problems. "Children don't just appear, preacher. Someone bore this child. Someone abandoned him. In my experience, such circumstances usually involve sin that needs addressing." The baby had finished feeding and was making small, contented sounds. Samuel lifted him to his shoulder, patting gently as Martha had taught him. Hope settled against his neck with complete trust, tiny fingers tangling in Samuel's collar. "The child needs care, not judgment," Samuel said quietly. "Whatever circumstances brought him here, he's innocent of them." "Innocent?" Morrison's voice rose slightly. "Bastard children are born from sin, preacher. Their very existence is testimony to moral failure. The town has a right to know who among us has fallen so far from grace." Samuel felt anger building in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. In 5 years of ministry in Mercy Creek, he had learned to navigate Morrison's rigid views, to find diplomatic ways around the man's harsh judgments. But holding Hope, feeling the child's complete dependence on him, Samuel found his patience wearing thin. "Judge Morrison," he said, standing carefully with the baby still against his shoulder, "this is a house of God, a place where the lost are found, where the broken are made whole. If you want to discuss sin and redemption, I'm happy to do that. But I won't stand here and listen to you call an innocent child names." Morrison's eyes flashed with something cold and dangerous. "You forget yourself, preacher. I am an elder of this church. I help pay for your living here. And I have responsibilities to this community that go beyond your soft heart." The church door opened behind Morrison, and Martha entered carrying her daily supply of milk. She moved slowly up the aisle, taking an attention between the two men with eyes that missed nothing. When she reached them, she set down her bundle and looked directly at Morrison. "Judge," she said with a small nod. Her voice held the careful politeness that people in Mercy Creek used when they wanted to avoid trouble. "Martha," Morrison replied, "perhaps you can shed some light on this situation. You know everyone in town. Whose child is this?" Martha's weathered hands smoothed her worn apron, a nervous gesture Samuel had never seen from her before. "Can't say I know, Judge. Sometimes people pass through town. Sometimes circumstances happen that we don't hear about." Morrison studied her face with the same intensity he had used on Samuel. "I've been making inquiries, Martha, about young women who might have been absent recently, about families who might have sent daughters away for extended visits." Samuel felt the baby tense against his shoulder, as if hope could sense the adult tension surrounding him. He swayed gently, making small soothing sounds while watching Martha's face. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but he could see something working behind her eyes. "Lots of young folks visit family," Martha said carefully. "Nothing unusual about that. My daughter, for instance," Morrison continued, his voice deceptively casual. "She's been visiting her aunt in Denver for 3 months now." Sudden decision. Left in quite a hurry. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The pieces he had been trying not to put together suddenly fell into place with sickening clarity. Judge Morrison's daughter, Rebecca, blue eyes like summer sky. Handwriting he had seen on church volunteer lists and social announcements. A girl who had always been kind to everyone, regardless of their station or race. Martha's face had gone pale, but she said nothing. Morrison continued watching her with predator patience. "Rebecca was always willful," Morrison said, "always too friendly with people beneath her station. I had to correct such behavior more than once." His eyes moved to the baby in Samuel's arms. Children sometimes inherit more than just physical features from their parents. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Samuel understood now what Morrison was really saying, what he suspected, and why he was here asking questions. The judge wasn't just curious about some random foundling. He was hunting for confirmation of his worst fears about his own daughter. Hope made a small sound and turned his face toward the light streaming through the stained glass. Those blue eyes, Morrison's eyes, Rebecca's eyes, caught the colored light like pieces of sky. Samuel felt the weight of truth settling on him like a heavy coat. "Judge," Martha said suddenly, her voice stronger now, "maybe we should talk privately." Morrison turned to her with sharp attention. "You know something?" "I know lots of things," Martha replied. "Question is whether speaking them helps anyone or just causes more hurt." Samuel watched this exchange with growing understanding. Martha did know something. Had known from the moment she saw the baby, probably. Had recognized those eyes. Maybe even knew more about Rebecca's disappearance than she had let on. Morrison stepped closer to Martha, his voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. "If my daughter has brought shame on this family, I need to know. The town needs to know. Sin hidden in darkness only grows stronger." "And what would you do with that knowledge?" Martha asked. "If it were true?" Morrison's face hardened. "What needs to be done? What should have been done months ago when I first suspected she was being corrupted by that Mexican boy?" The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. The Mexican boy, the young man who had died at the end of Morrison's rope, accused of stealing horses. Samuel remembered Rebecca at the hanging, how she had stood at the back of the crowd with tears streaming down her face, how she had left town the very next day. "You knew," Samuel said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "When you hanged that boy, you knew he wasn't just a horse thief." Morrison turned on him with eyes like winter ice. "I knew he was a corrupting influence on my daughter. I knew he needed to be removed before he could do more damage." The truth crashed over Samuel like a flood. The young Mexican hadn't died for stealing horses. He had died for loving the wrong woman, died for sins he may never have committed, condemned by a father who couldn't bear the thought of his daughter choosing love over propriety. Samuel looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully against his shoulder, innocent of all the adult hatred and prejudice that had brought him into existence. This child was the product of that forbidden love, the living proof of everything Morrison had tried to destroy. His father was a good man who never got the chance to hold his son, Samuel whispered, remembering the words from the note. Now he understood why they had been written with such pain. Morrison's face went white, then red with rage. You know whose child this is? Samuel met his eyes steadily. I know this is a child who needs protection, and I intend to give it to him. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Martha stepped closer to Samuel, her presence offering support without words. Outside, the sounds of Mercy Creek continued, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its foundation. Finally, Morrison spoke, his voice deadly quiet. That child is an abomination, the fruit of sin and corruption. He has no place in this town, in this church. I want him gone by Sunday. No, Samuel said simply. Morrison stared at him as if he had never heard the word before. What did you say? I said no. This child stays, under my protection, in this church, for as long as he needs sanctuary. The judge's hand moved instinctively toward the gun he wore at his hip, a gesture so automatic he probably didn't realize he was making it. Samuel saw it and stepped back slightly, shielding Hope with his body. You're making a mistake, preacher, Morrison said. This town won't stand for it. The congregation won't stand for it. Then I guess we'll find out what kind of people we really are, Samuel replied. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. His boots echoed in the church like thunder, each step a promise of trouble to come. At the doorway, he paused without looking back. Sunday, preacher. Make your choice by Sunday. After he left, Samuel sank into the front pew, suddenly exhausted. Martha sat beside him, her weathered hand touching Hope's tiny fist. You know what this means, she said quietly. Samuel nodded. He was choosing sides in a war he had tried to avoid for 3 months. But looking down at Hope's peaceful face, he found he had no regrets about the choice itself, only about how much it was going to cost before it was over. Sunday morning arrives like Judgment Day, with the whole town filling the church pews to witness Samuel's sermon about a baby named Hope. Rebecca Morrison returns from hiding, thin but alive, ready to claim her son and face her father's rage. Samuel's words about love crossing boundaries and mercy conquering judgment change hearts one by one, until even the hardest souls begin to soften. As the story ends, the great bronze bell rings for the first time since the hanging. Not for death and judgment, but for baptism and new beginnings in a place learning to choose love over fear. Sunday morning came too soon and not soon enough. Samuel had spent the night walking the church aisles, holding Hope when the baby fussed, practicing words he might never get the chance to say. The sermon he had planned to preach lay forgotten on his desk. Instead, his mind was full of other words, harder words about truth and mercy and the cost of standing up for what was right. Martha arrived before dawn with more milk and the kind of quiet strength that came from living through too many battles to be afraid of one more. She took Hope without asking, settling into the front pew with the easy competence of someone who had raised children before. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the air, staying unusually quiet in her arms. They'll all come, Martha said as Samuel paced behind the altar. Word's gotten around. Judge Morrison made sure of that. Samuel nodded. He had expected as much. In a town like Mercy Creek, scandal spread faster than wildfire. By now, everyone would know about the foundling at the church, about Morrison's ultimatum, about the choice their preacher had to make. The first congregants began arriving an hour before service time. Samuel watched through the church windows as families gathered outside, talking in small groups with the kind of hushed urgency that accompanied significant events. Some faces looked curious, others concerned. A few showed the hard satisfaction of people anticipating drama. Judge Morrison arrived precisely on time, as he always did. He wore his best black suit and walked with the measured steps of a man carrying authority like a weapon. His wife followed 2 steps behind, her face carefully blank in the way of women who had learned not to question their husbands' decisions. They took their usual place in the front pew, across the aisle from where Martha sat holding Hope. The church filled steadily. Samuel recognized most faces, people he had baptized, married, buried. People who had welcomed him 5 years ago when he arrived fresh from seminary, full of idealistic dreams about ministry. People who had trusted him to guide them through spiritual questions and moral difficulties. Now they watched him with uncertain eyes, waiting to see what kind of man their preacher really was. Just as Samuel was about to begin the service, the church door opened one more time. A figure stepped inside, thin and pale, moving with the careful steps of someone still recovering from illness or hardship. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Rebecca Morrison. She had always been pretty, but now she looked like someone who had walked through fire and barely survived. Her once round face was gaunt, her blue dress hanging loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. But her eyes, those same remarkable blue eyes now watching him from Hope's face, were steady and determined. The church fell completely silent as Rebecca walked down the center aisle. Her father's face went white, then red, then white again. Her mother made a small sound that might have been a prayer or a sob. Everyone else simply stared as the girl they thought was visiting relatives in Denver took a seat in the back pew. Samuel felt his heart racing, but also felt a strange calm settling over him. Whatever happened next, at least the pretending was over. At least the truth could be spoken in the light instead of whispered in shadows. He looked out at the congregation, at faces he had come to know and love, at people who were about to hear things that would challenge everything they thought they knew about righteousness and redemption. In the front pew, Hope made a small sound and reached toward the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. "Before we begin today's service," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church, "I want to tell you about Hope." Some people shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward. Judge Morrison's face was carved from stone. "3 days ago, God placed a child in my care. A baby boy, innocent and perfect, who came to us in need of love and protection." Samuel gestured toward Martha, who lifted Hope slightly so everyone could see him. "I've been calling him Hope because that's what children are. They're proof that God believes in tomorrow, that he trusts us enough to keep placing new souls in our imperfect hands." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Samuel saw some faces soften as they looked at the baby, saw others harden with the judgment they had already decided to render. "Some of you have asked about his parents," Samuel continued. "Some of you have demanded to know whose sin brought him into existence. But I want to ask you a different question." He paused, looking directly at Judge Morrison. "What if the real sin isn't in how this child was conceived, but in how we choose to receive him?" Morrison's face darkened, but he said nothing. In the back pew, Rebecca was crying silently, tears streaming down her thin cheeks. Samuel stepped out from behind the altar, moving closer to his congregation. "There was a young man in our town 3 months ago. A Mexican boy who worked hard, caused no trouble, hurt no one. We hanged him for stealing horses, but I wonder now if his real crime was different. I wonder if his real crime was loving someone he wasn't supposed to love." The murmurs grew louder. Some people looked confused, others uncomfortable. A few began to understand where Samuel was leading them. "Love doesn't always follow the rules we make for it," Samuel said. "It crosses lines we draw, ignores boundaries we insist on, finds ways to exist even when we try to kill it." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "And sometimes love creates new life, innocent life, life that deserves protection regardless of the circumstances of its creation." "Enough," Judge Morrison said, rising from his pew. "This is blasphemy. You're encouraging sin, preacher, condoning behavior that what?" Samuel interrupted, something he had never done before. that produced this beautiful child, that brought hope into the world. He gestured again toward Hope, who was watching the proceedings with those bright blue eyes. Judge Morrison, your daughter loved someone. Someone loved her back. They created new life together. If that's sin, then it's the most beautiful sin I've ever witnessed. The church erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. Morrison's face went purple with rage, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the noise. He's right. Everyone turned toward the back of the church where Rebecca had risen to her feet. Her voice was weak but clear, carrying the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "The preacher's right," she repeated, walking slowly down the aisle toward the front pew where Martha held her son. "I love Carlos Mendez. He loved me. We planned to marry, to leave this town together, and start over somewhere people wouldn't care about the color of his skin or my father's disapproval." Morrison stepped into the aisle, blocking her path. "Rebecca, you will not disgrace this family further. You will not. I will claim my son," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I will tell the truth about the man you murdered." The word hung in the air like thunder. "Carlos never stole those horses. You know it, and I know it. You hanged him because he dared to love your daughter." The church fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Heavy with truth that couldn't be taken back, thick with implications that would change everything. Martha stood slowly and walked toward Rebecca, carrying Hope. The baby reached out as she approached, small hands grasping toward his mother with the instinct that connects parent and child across any distance. When Martha placed him in Rebecca's arms, the young woman's composure finally broke. She held her son against her chest and sobbed with the sound of someone who had been holding back tears for months. Hope seemed to recognize her, settling against her with a contentment Samuel had never seen in him before. The sight of mother and child, reunited, moved through the congregation like a physical force. "Look at them," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying in the absolute stillness. "Look at love made flesh. Look at hope holding hope." He turned to face Judge Morrison, who stood frozen in the aisle like a man watching his world collapse. "Judge, that's your grandson. Your blood. Your family. The question now is whether you'll choose love or pride." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun again, an automatic gesture of a man who had always solved problems with force. But this time, other hands moved too. Men in the congregation shifted, ready to intervene. Women clutched their own children closer, understanding suddenly that this wasn't just about one baby or one family. This was about what kind of community they wanted to be. "You're all fools," Morrison said, his voice breaking with rage and something that might have been grief. "That child is the product of sin. She's a whore who lay with a Mexican. And that bastard is enough." The word came from his own wife, spoken so quietly it was almost a whisper. But in the silence of the church, everyone heard it. "Mrs." Morrison had risen from her pew, her face pale but determined. "Enough, Henry. She's our daughter. He's our grandson. Enough." Morrison stared at his wife as if she were a stranger. In 25 years of marriage, Samuel had never heard her contradict her husband about anything. Now she walked over to where Rebecca stood, holding Hope, and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's cheek. "You're too thin, Mrs." Morrison said, her voice full of the pain of a mother who had been forced to send her child away. "You need food, rest. You need to come home." Rebecca looked at her mother with cautious hope. "And hope? Will he be welcome?" Mrs. Morrison looked down at her grandson, at those familiar blue eyes and the small face that carried traces of both parents. She touched one tiny fist with a grandmother's wonder. "He's family," she said simply. The words seemed to release something in the church. People began standing, moving, talking in normal voices instead of shocked whispers. Some approached Rebecca to welcome her home. Others gathered around Martha to ask about the baby's needs. The rigid lines of judgment and condemnation that had filled the room began to soften into something more human. But Judge Morrison remained frozen in the aisle, isolated by his own choices. Samuel approached him with careful steps, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "Judge," he said quietly, "your grandson needs his grandfather. Rebecca needs your father. Your family needs healing, not more judgment." Morrison's face cycled through emotions too quickly to follow. Rage, grief, pride, fear, and something that might have been longing all fought for control. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I can't take it back," he said. "I can't bring him back." Samuel understood. Morrison wasn't just talking about accepting his grandson. He was talking about Carlos Mendez, about the life he had taken in anger and prejudice. That was a burden that would never leave him, a choice that couldn't be undone. "No," Samuel agreed. "You can't. But you can choose differently from here forward. You can choose love over fear, mercy over judgment. You can choose to be the grandfather hope deserves." Morrison looked across the church to where his wife stood with Rebecca and the baby. His daughter was explaining something to her mother, probably about Hope's feeding schedule or sleeping habits. Normal conversations between women who shared the care of children. Mrs. Morrison was nodding and smiling, already falling into the role of grandmother. The sight seemed to break something in Morrison's chest. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since Samuel had known him, the judge looked like an old man instead of a force of nature. "I don't know how," he whispered. "One day at a time," Samuel replied. "One choice at a time. Starting now." Morrison stood there for another long moment, wrestling with pride and love and 25 years of rigid thinking. Then he walked slowly across the church to where his family waited. Hope looked up at him with those bright blue eyes, unafraid and curious. When Morrison extended one finger, the baby grasped it with surprising strength. "Hello, grandson," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry it took me so long to meet you properly." Samuel felt tears on his own cheeks as he watched the reunion. Around the church, other conversations were happening, other hearts were changing. People who had come expecting judgment were witnessing grace instead. People who had come to see scandal were seeing love triumph over fear. He walked to the bell rope that had hung and used for 3 months, the rope he had avoided touching since the hanging. His hands closed around the thick hemp, and he looked up at the great bronze bell that had called the town to witness death. Today, it would call them to witness life. Samuel pulled the rope with all his strength. The bell's voice rang out over Mercy Creek, deep and golden and full of hope. It rang for Carlos Mendez, who had died for love. It rang for Rebecca, who had found the courage to come home. It rang for Hope, who had brought a divided community back together. And it rang for second chances, for forgiveness that seemed impossible until it happened, for love that was stronger than fear or prejudice or pride. The sound echoed off the mesa walls and rolled across the desert, carrying the news to anyone who cared to listen. Mercy Creek had remembered how to choose mercy. A child named Hope had taught them all what hope could do when it was given the chance to grow. In the months that followed, the story would be told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but never losing its essential truth. They would say that love had conquered hate, that a baby had healed a broken town, that sometimes the most unlikely people could teach the most important lessons. But on that Sunday morning, as the bell rang and the congregation celebrated new life instead of mourning death, Samuel simply held onto the rope and let the sound wash over him like a blessing. He had found his voice again, found his purpose again, found his faith in human goodness again. All because a baby named Hope had cried in the darkness, and someone had decided to answer with light. The preacher found a baby in the church bell tower with a note that made him question everything.